أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Today I'd like to go back to a few of the topics that have been under discussion on our Tarbiyyat department forums. Topics that are on the minds of a lot of Ahmadis, particularly Ahmadi youth living here in the United States. And as we've observed, that it's often questions that have to do with marriage or the time before marriage or afterwards, family harmony and that sort of thing, that usually drives the most interest and conversation, and is something that is of common concern and a constant source of some type of agitation within society and within families. Even those families that are in a great deal of harmony are always in need of knowing how we can improve the harmony within our families. And then also, particularly when we encounter these different situations, then it's important to know how Ahmadiyya and Islam has taught us to go about the way we behave. Now, one area that raises many questions and about which sometimes there is not clarity is the type of interaction that is advised and that is permitted between the genders as far as the teachings of Islam go. This applies particularly before marriage, but it also applies to those people who are already married. That when they're involved in different types of work, professional work or whatever it is, then what is the appropriate type of interaction which is permitted in Islam and which is taught by the traditions of the Jamaat? This is something that does not just apply to our work lives, but it applies now to our Jamaat lives as well. Because in our professional lives, in our educational lives, we have interaction between the genders. And it may seem that in our Jamaat lives there is separation as far as the halls is concerned and as far as auxiliary organizations is concerned. But still there is a lot of opportunities and a lot of times where it is necessary to work together. For example, in many of the national departments, there are Lajna and Ansar and Khuddam members working together to make those departments move forward and work. In the Tabligh department, there's active work happening in Tabligh on social media, on Twitter and other areas. In Tarbiyyat and in Talim al-Quran and other departments, there are many Lajna and Khuddam and Ansar members working together as a group professionally towards a certain end, and not working as members of an auxiliary, but working as members of a Jamaat on a national program. So in all of these areas, these questions do arise, that what is the appropriate level of interaction and what is the sort of professionalism that should be maintained as far as what Islam and Ahmadiyyat has taught. The advice that Huzur has given, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Rabi and Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Khamis Sayyidahullah Ta'ala bin Nasri al-Aziz, is essentially that interaction is permitted so long as it is professional, but social interaction is not. And that is essentially in one sentence what all of the advice is. And so this is to be kept in mind in the educational world and in the professional world. And in whatever interaction that happens online under the tablighi or tarbiyyati purposes, this is one thing that should be borne in mind, that each interaction should be weighed with this intention in mind, that what is the intention behind that interaction. Now this is something that is an effort that has to be made on an individual level, and this is not something that is always or needs to be enforced from outside, but understanding the wisdom as to why this command is given is what steers us clear of many of the dangers that arise. What Islam has taught us and what Allah Ta'ala has taught us is that in Islam there is no such thing as purely a social friendship between genders, purely as being just friends. And this is a topic that we have covered before. And so this just, from another angle, is a point that needs review again and again. And it is something that we need to have a special attention towards intention as well. There are many times where there is professional interaction that becomes necessary. And that is why in Islamic society, separation of the genders is not something that is universally applied in every area. Where there is only professional interaction, then there is a mixing of genders. For example, even in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the markets were always mixed. There was never any segregation of a men's market and a women's market. It's because that's a place where people go to professionally interact. But where there is primarily a social aspect, or where there is not a need for any kind of interaction between the genders, there the halls have always been divided. And this is what we see in our masjids as well, and this is what we see at Jalsa Salana as well. Now one could ask that why is it that when we have guests who come for our Jalsa Salana, and many times there are women who are guests as well, why do they come to the men's side? And if women can come to the men's side, then why not just have a mixed gathering as we would if Ahmadis were to attend a gathering that's organized by other people, another community, another religious community or social group as well? Then why is it that we at our Jalsas have that segregation of genders? The reason is because this is the ideal of Islamic society that we eventually will establish here in the United States as well. These are the Islamic ideals and the social ideals which are to be established. And so if they are not even established within our mosques and within our Jamaat functions, then the entire tradition would begin to disappear from among us. So that separation of genders is something that is the norm which we begin here in the masjid or in our functions or at Jalsa Salana. And that norm is to be expanded and to be spread through convincing to the remainder of society. So that is something that is to be maintained in our behavior and our etiquettes as we interact outside of the Jamaat as well. It isn't that, when we come to the masjid, then there's a very appropriate and very formal way in which we have a separation of the genders. But then when we work together in our Jamaat projects that require interaction between the genders, or when we interact on social media, then it's as if there's no sort of formality, there is no sort of barrier, there is no type of parda that exists anymore. That is a type of double standard that starts to exist. Then either there is something wrong with what we are doing here at the masjid, there is something wrong with what we are doing outside of the masjid. There has to be a consistency between the two. So we have to appreciate what the wisdom is behind that separation of the genders that we have at our masjid and that we have at jalsas and at all these different areas. And the basic reason is because of the wrongs that we see happening around us in society. Because the way in which women particularly, and both women and men, are suffering because of that open interaction that exists between the genders. So now that the Jamaat is in a phase that there is a lot of work that is being done on a professional level, on a national level, in different areas, where Lajna and Khudam and Ansar are working together. And this is something that is important to be remembered and kept in mind. That wherever there is a professional action, then a person should be professional about it. It is not ethical even that a person should interact with somebody on a professional level while having intentions of courtship in the back of their mind, while looking for a spouse and trying to find out more about them by means of that professional interaction. So this sort of etiquette and this professionalism is important to keep in mind as we go into these different types of situations. Now another question that arises is, why is there a difference before marriage in that the bride is assigned a wali, or a guardian who looks after her interests and advises her during the period before marriage, whereas the groom is not assigned a wali? So why is this difference made between men and women and between the bride and the groom? And why is it that the groom is his own wali in a way? Hazrat Muslim Maud answered this question in Ahmadiyya, Yani Hakiki Islam. He wrote that a difference has been kept between man and woman because a man naturally is less shy in such matters, and he himself inquires about her character. And the woman is shy and her emotions are sensitive, and as a result of which she quickly comes under deception. Now here what Hazrat Muslim Maud has described is that when it comes to searching for a prospective spouse, there's a fundamental difference between the way men and women behave in this situation. And what's described here is that in particular situations, the gender differences that exist between men and women, they become more pronounced than they otherwise would. This is not something that is of universal application. For example, in the professional world, obviously a woman does not need a wali or a guardian to give his approval or give his consent before she finalizes the decision on anything. The reason is because in a professional atmosphere, those gender differences are not as acute, they're not as noticeable. And so they do not play as much of a role within the interaction between men and women, within the interaction that people have among each other. However, when it comes to searching for a spouse, or when it comes to the relationship of marriage, or the relationship that men have with one another within that intimate or romantic relationship, their gender differences become far more pronounced. And this happens, and this is something that becomes more and more obvious when conflict management happens as well. For example, if there is some conflict that is happening in a professional environment, in a classroom where students are having a disagreement, where perhaps workers are having a disagreement in a workplace, then when that conflict is resolved, it's not very often that gender differences are taken into account. That women behave particularly in a certain way and men behave peculiarly in a different way. In that kind of environment, those differences are not taken as much into account. However, when there's marriage counseling, those people who are psychiatrists, those people who deal often with the problems that arise between husbands and wives, these peculiarities and these differences in behavior between men and women, these gender differences, they are something that are always the center of focus, and respecting and appreciating and recognizing them is a basic fundamental in being able to solve these problems. So looking into gender differences and addressing a problem based on gender differences in the professional world may come off as being sexist. It may come off as being stereotypical almost. That if we have a work environment and if there's a difference of opinion between a random man and a woman, to start taking gender roles into account, then that may actually seem out of place. But when a marriage counselor does it, when a psychiatrist or a therapist does it, then not only is it completely appropriate, but it is actually a necessary thing. And the reason is that in that intimate interaction, in the context of a marriage, for men and women, their gender roles and their gender-specific behaviors and their emotions and their desires come out far more to the forefront. And this is what Islam has taken into account. That when a person is searching for a spouse, this is not a professional activity that a person is going into. It's not something that we remain detached from. But all those who have gone through this, they know that it is a very emotionally involved process, and it is a situation and a period in our lives where feelings of shyness are acutely felt. And it is during this time, as is with throughout the course of a person's life, with a mutual partner in their lives and a marriage life, that emotions play a great role. And that sort of shyness that exists more in girls is something that becomes far more pronounced. And so this is what Huzur describes here. That in this situation, both men and women, both the boys and the girls, they feel shy in this situation. But still boys are more direct in that they are more able to ask the more direct and necessary questions that they need to ask in order to find out important information about their spouse who they are looking into. However, because of the peculiarity of the situation, the emotionally charged environment, it is less likely that girls will ask those important and direct questions because of that shyness that is acutely felt during these times and during this situation. And so it is this gender difference that Islam has taken into account. But that gender difference is not applied universally to every situation, but particularly those situations where gender differences become more acutely apparent and visible. Hazrat Muslim Maud Radhiyallahu Anhu wrote that if this command is implemented, then many of the deceptions and frauds that are done to good-natured, trusting women would immediately be removed. So this system that Islam has established, of there being a wali or a guardian in the marriage for the bride, a person who looks after the rights of the bride and asks the questions that are necessary to be found out about the groom-to-be, about the prospective husband, his purpose is to fulfill that responsibility. And then obviously, as a side note, that the wali's responsibility is to look after the rights of the wife or the bride. And where it is found that the wali of a bride is repeatedly abusing that authority or that power, that responsibility that Allah Ta'ala has placed on him, there the wali can be made by the permission of the Khalifa into either the Khalifa himself takes up that responsibility or someone else is assigned to fulfill that responsibility. So in this way, this is a very important and sacred responsibility that Allah Ta'ala confers. So this is also another question that arises as to why there is this difference. And also understanding this difference can give us some level of insight in how we should approach this situation when we find ourselves in it. Whether we ourselves find ourselves in that situation or whether we are finding our children in that situation. How to navigate our way through it. Then a third question that arises about the process before a marriage is what level of interaction is appropriate between a couple before they get married. Now this question has a few different contexts in which it can exist. There's one phase before marriage which often, for various reasons, gets prolonged, which is the stage between nikah and the actual marriage, or the rukhsati that takes place, where the couple begin to live together. Now, many times this can be done on the same day. Even it can happen where the nikah is announced and then the couple leave the masjid and then go home together, and that itself can be the rukhsati. There is no need for there to be a meal or anything like that. In fact, it may even be preferable to do it without formality or anything like that. However, sometimes that period between the nikah and the actual moving in together becomes prolonged for various reasons. Perhaps the couple have to live apart for a long period of time, there are immigration issues, perhaps they're still getting settled, they're still finishing their education and they don't want to get married before they finish their education, various reasons. Sometimes that period of nikah that is before the actual rukhsati, it lasts for months, and perhaps sometimes it even goes to a point of a year or a couple of years. And so that's one phase and context of this question. Now another context is, what about the phase before the nikah? Sometimes families, they agree upon a marriage before the nikah, they consider that to be an engagement, or what's called or referred to as a mangni. So what is the level of farda and what is the level of interaction that should exist during that phase? Well, Hazur Ayyadahullah Ta'ala bin Nasri al-Aziz has given guidance on the period between the nikah and the rukhsati. Hazur said that after the nikah and before the formal rukhsati, it is better that some distance remain. Now here, this is a phase where the couple are actually officially husband and wife. Now there is no longer parda that exists between them, and they can begin to live together whenever they choose to. No one has a right to raise any objection. But still, despite that, Huzur has advised that because of many of the cases that come forward, that when the couple are not living together, when they're not able to create that understanding that happens when two people are living under the same roof and in that sort of environment of being in the same living quarters, there when interactions happen, and a lot of times it can be misleading and they bring up problems that are meaningless and actually become a means of the breaking of that relationship. And so this is one of the reasons why Huzur has advised that even during this phase, when there is no real restriction in that sense from Islamically as to their interaction, but still it is advisable that they keep a distance to avoid many of the unnecessary problems that arise. Now this is the advice of Huzur regarding that stage where the nikah has already been done, and if the husband chooses to leave the wife, Islamically he is still responsible to pay for half of her dowry. He still has this responsibility, and he is accountable for making that decision of breaking the relationship. So then based on this perspective, we can understand what level of interaction should be there if even the nikah hasn't been done. Engagement or a mangni, we have to remember, is not Islamically any relationship. It is not recognized as any kind of a relationship by which responsibilities come on either one of the spouse or they have rights upon each other. It is not something that removes the limitations of parda that exist there. And so this is something that should be borne in mind, that sometimes when interaction begins between a couple right after their families decide on the engagement, where they begin calling each other or interacting freely, this is something that according to the teachings of Islam is not appropriate. However, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Rabi Rahimahullah Ta'ala has described that there is a level of interaction which Allah Ta'ala has described in the Holy Quran, which is fine and which is appropriate and which is in fact in a way encouraged in the phase before the actual nikah, when the couple are considering one another for marriage. Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Rabi Rahimahullah Ta'ala said that, but according to Islam, I believe that if in the presence of the parents, the wooer, as in the one who seeks the hand of the girl, if he is invited to a family dinner and he sits there, and the would-be bride also shares the table, then there is no harm. Because on that there is an independent verse of the Holy Quran. There is no harm for you to eat with your parents and this and that. And Huzur says that in such relatives, O Siddiqikum, that is also mentioned. And then it says there is no harm whether you eat together or separately. Huzur was referring to chapter 24, verse 62. And so Huzur goes on to say that, so why is this together mentioned? This means that in fact Siddiq is a friend of the family who is a true, honest and trustworthy person, not anybody who comes. So it is not permitted to invite visitors and to start eating with the visitors in the presence of your family. This is not what the Holy Quran means. A regular friend of the family who has respect, who has honor, who has trust, such people can also be invited to share the table, if the parents decide. So why not then such a wooer, or the person who seeks the hand of the girl, why not such a person who has in fact requested to be a member of the whole family? Huzur said that in such cases, invite the wooer, as in the one who wants to marry your daughter, and sit with him and your daughter respectively, of course, without showing her zina, and let her judge for herself. that much is right. So in this way, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Rabi rahimahullah ta'ala explained the level of permissible interaction. And this level and these sort of guidelines are given by our Khulafa and the teachings of Islam because it has been experienced consistently, time and again, that when these guidelines are deviated from, when because of that sort of excitement and that infatuation, people go head first into interaction which is not permitted or which is not encouraged in Islam, then relationships begin to break for reasons that are not legitimate, for reasons that are not good or that would have ended up being a means of actually helping the person later in their lives. But it raises problems that could have easily been avoided. It raises unnecessary problems. So these are various etiquettes that is important to keep in mind before a marriage. The levels of professionalism that should exist before any kind of interaction of marriage or anything like that is taking place. Wherever there is an interaction between genders, we should remember that Hazur has advised that it always be of a professional nature. And we also be mindful of our intentions that it is professional. Then also, it is important to remember that the reason that a wali is appointed for the bride is because of the very specific nature of this relationship, in that it is an emotionally charged relationship. And especially before the actual marriage takes place, there is a degree of shyness and there is a degree of a sort of distorted perception of the other person that exists. And that is something that has to be addressed and acknowledged in one way or the other. And that's also important to take into account. And then finally, communication between the couple. It should be remembered, and there should be clarity on this, that simply an engagement or a money does not mean that parda no longer exists, that this command of the Holy Quran no longer exists. It is only nikah that makes a person a husband and a wife. And then Huzur has even advised that during that period after the nikah and before the formal rukhsati, there should remain some distance so that the marriage is saved from unnecessary harm and from misunderstandings that can arise. So these are points that we can keep in mind on guidelines of Islam for the phase that exists before marriage. Now today, Huzur mentioned in his khutbah the importance, and he emphasized the importance of congregational prayer. And this is an area that no matter where we are at, it is an area that we can improve. To observe more congregational prayers if we are living far from a masjid or a salat center, then within our homes, and then to make it more of a regular habit to attend congregational prayers in the masjid. Now alhamdulillah, here in Masjid Mubarak, the attendance is generally known as being a good attendance that we have at Isha time and perhaps at Fajr time. But still, it is always something that we can improve on an individual level. And Hazur also mentioned that this is something that should be a communal thing. That when we go for namaz, that we should try and invite our neighbors in some way or the other. We should mention it to them. So this is something that we can reflect on as well, that what is a way that we can bring this up in conversation, in a way that we do it, that it is a sort of group activity, where we hold one another accountable in one way or the other. Now this can apply between friends within the Jamaat, and it can even apply between spouses as well. Sometimes spouses, they may feel uncomfortable reminding each other about prayer because they have never done it up until that point. Sometimes it happens where if two people have never spoken about spirituality or about namaz, then suddenly bringing the subject up, it feels to them as if it is an infringement on that other person's personal space or their area of where a subject that is somehow perhaps becomes taboo after a long period of time. So this is one area that we can reflect on, that how is it that we can sort of approach this subject with someone who we may feel awkward bringing it up with, whether it is our spouse or whether it is a friend or someone, on how to improve our congregational prayers and our regularity in it. And this way, we can slowly bring an improvement in this aspect of our obligation to Allah Almighty. Already I've seen that after the khutbah, just in the few hours that have happened, there's been some activity in the sort of Khuddam chat group about how we can improve this. And I hope also in the other auxiliaries as well, we try and find different ways and come up with different ideas on how we can improve the congregational prayers and start that conversation so that slowly by means of that we can develop a better habit. And through this habit, obviously, the ultimate purpose is to increase in our love for Allah Almighty and improve our relationship with Him. So may Allah Almighty improve our relationship with Him and teach us the etiquettes of living a life as Allah Almighty has taught. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. There are a few announcements. This is a reminder to all Central Virginia, Khudam and Atfal, and also I assume this applies to North Virginia as well, that the first quarter for MKA will end tomorrow. So please contribute towards your MKA agenda to the Nazim Mall. And the Central Virginia Nazim Mall will be available outside after Jummah prayer. And also there is a request for prayers that please remember all members who are sick and going through treatment, especially the mother of Harun and Mamoon Rashid Sahib, Sajjada Tahir Latif Sahib, Abdul Sami Jadran Sahib, Mansoor Pal Sahib and Sister Askari Chaudhry Sahiba, who are suffering from serious illness. May Allah grant them full and speedy recovery. Then there's a announcement that Allah Ta'ala has blessed, this is an announcement from Hamid Khan Sahib, who is Zaim Ansarullah, that Allah Ta'ala has blessed my son Noman Khan and his wife Rabia Khan Sahiba of Ashburn with a daughter on January 27th, 2015. The baby is named Roha Fatima Khan. Members are requested to pray for the long and prosperous life of the newborn and that she may be a true Ahmadi. Also the prayer timings, Fajr is at 6 o'clock a.m., Zuhr at 1 o'clock p.m., Asr 4 o'clock p.m., Maghrib 5:45 p.m. and Isha at 7:30 p.m. Ibadallah, Rahimakumullah, Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsani wa ita'i zil qurba wa yanha 'anil fahsha'i wal munkari wal baghi ya'izukum la'allakum tazakkarun. Uzkurullaha yazkurkum wad'uhu yastajib lakum wa lazikrullahi akbar.